The American Adoption Congress 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 38.
Workshop is Being Adopted, Being Bicultural. My name is Penny Callan Partridge, and in this workshop we're going to use the experience of bicultural people to explore the adoptee experience. But let me tell you a little bit about myself first and how I got interested in this subject. I'm an adoptee. Partridge is my adoptive name. Callan is my original first name. I'm reconnected with both my birth parents, directly with my birth mother and indirectly with my birth father, who had died when I was still in high school, but I am very close now to the child of his marriage, my half-brother. I'm an adoptive parent of two, and both of those adoptions are open adoptions, different kinds of open adoptions. And I'm a clinical social worker, but I've spent more time on the self-help side of all this stuff than on the professional side. And I'm now writing a book about the adoptee experience. After finding my birth mother, I suddenly had so much more perspective on everything than I'd ever had before, but especially on myself as an adoptee. And I had thought that various things about me had to do with my individual inadequacies, rather than the challenges that all adoptees are faced with. So ever since that experience of suddenly feeling enlightened about myself as an adoptee, not instantaneously because it was hard work and took me a long time to get there, but I've been looking for ways that we can be clearer about what these challenges are that all adoptees face. And I think of it as like driving in a car in a place you've never been. It helps if you have a map. It helps if you know what to look for. It helps to orient yourself. And so in this book that I'm writing, I've ended up with 9 different angles from which we can look at the adoptee experience. And this is one of them, this trying to use the bicultural experience as a metaphor for the adoptee experience. I had always been attracted to people and to books by people who had complicated identities. And I never connected that to my own having a complicated identity until I did this big deal thing of connecting with my original identity. And then I read these books that I'm going to talk about today, and I say, oh, that's like being adopted. That's like being adopted. And so I am really excited about the chance to share with other adoptees some of this stuff that I think is just wonderful in terms of how it applies to our experience as adoptees. And for some of you who are bicultural, apart from being adoptees, you might identify with these things even more. Here are 2 quotes to start with. Listen to these and see if you think that you can apply them to your experience. The first is from Erik Erikson, who's a psychoanalyst but also an adoptee, who only found out when he was a teenager that the father he was growing up with was his adoptive father. He's also an immigrant. And he's talking here about the immigrant experience. Identity problems were in the mental baggage of generations of new Americans who left their motherlands, fatherlands behind to merge their ancestral identities in the common one of the self-made men. Emigration can be a hard and heartless matter in terms of what is abandoned in the old country and what is usurped in the new one. Migration means cruel survival in identity terms too, for the very cataclysms in which millions perish open up new forms of identity to the survivors. I'm sure that Erikson was thinking partly about the Holocaust, in which millions died, but other people, including himself, ended up in new places that they would have never dreamed of living their lives, and in new kinds of lives. And I think of my own coming from the cataclysm of a desperately unwanted pregnancy, which opened up a new form of identity to me, which I would have to say, I know all adoptees don't feel this way, but I would have to say that this new identity that was opened up to me is probably a richer one than if I had grown up with my birth mother, or if I had been the biological child in my adoptive family. I mean, I feel that somehow combining the best parts of both ends up being who I choose to be. And this next quote I identify with even more. It's from Salman Rushdie, who is now in hiding because of a book he wrote, The Satanic Verses. But listen to this and see if you can identify with this. In writing the Satanic Verses, I think I was writing for the first time from the whole of myself. The English part, the Indian part, the part of me that loves London, and the part of me that longs for Bombay. At my typewriter alone, I could indulge this. But most of the time, people will ask anyone like me, are you Indian, Pakistani, English? What is being expressed here, listen to this, is a discomfort with a plural identity. And what I am saying to you and saying in the novel is that we have got to come to terms with this. We are increasingly becoming a world of migrants made up of bits and fragments from here, there. We are here, and we have never really left anywhere we have been. I'm now going to tell you about some of some books, which are not fiction like the Satanic Verses. They're memoirs by people with plural identities. The way we're going to turn this into a workshop instead of just a lecture is that after I tell you how I've been grabbed by some of this literature, I would like each of you to think about saying which of these and what about it really grabbed you and maybe why. And for none of you look like compulsive note takers, but I'd just like to say don't try to take notes on anything I say or read. But if you have like a flashback memory or a strong feeling about something I'm saying, jot down a note about that so you'll remember it and then come back to us and listen. And also, to not worry about taking notes or anything, all of these books they made us do like a bibliography for the syllabus, and I have some handouts that have most of these quotes in it. If we don't have as many handouts as we need, we'll make some more copies. The first book that I want to tell you about is called Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakatsuki Houston. Manzanar was an internment camp here in California where Japanese Americans were taken and confined during World War II. As an adult, this Japanese American woman takes her husband and children back to see this place where she had spent part of her childhood. In order to do this, she breaks through a kind of culturally imposed amnesia about the internment camps. And she is also breaking through her own emotional defenses and her family's own emotional defenses about having been held there. I grew up in Southern California, and I'll never forget my mother telling me that the Japanese kids in my class would have been born in these internment camps because I was born in 1944, and that's when they were there. The dictionary says that an internment camp is a prison camp for the confinement of enemy aliens, prisoners of war, political prisoners, And when the United States was at war with Japan, it categorically did not trust the loyalty of Japanese Americans. So people lost their homes, their businesses, and many of these people never fully recovered from being treated this way by their adopted country, or the adopted country of their parents or grandparents. It was Jean's father who made the best comment that I've ever heard about split loyalties. He said, and this was when he was being interrogated about whether he was loyal to this country or to Japan, he said, "When your mother and father are having a fight, do you want them to kill each other, or do you just want them to stop fighting?" Another memorable part of this book for me was after the war years, when Jean was in high school and she was elected Carnival Queen. Part of her humiliation around this event had to do with the dress that she and her mother picked out, which was very nice for her, but when she saw it in relation to her attendance dresses, which were all totally different, it suddenly seemed all wrong to her in comparison. But maybe she was set up for this humiliation because one of her friends had heard school staff counting up the votes and trying to change the votes because they were so uncomfortable with the idea of a non-white Carnival Queen. If you're voted Carnival Queen, you must belong to some extent, right? But do you belong in the same way as people who look and dress the same and who never have to question their belonging? Can you be different? This is my thoughts now. Can you be different and still really belong? Does different mean inferior? Are some differences acceptable and others not? And this is for thinking about what it was like to be in our adoptive families from whom we were not with whom we were not all alike in some ways. How far out on the fringes is someone perceived as different expected to stay? Can you belong in some ways and not in others? The next book is Hunger of Memory by Richard Rodriguez, who grew up in California with Mexican immigrant parents who barely spoke English. He found that his education in English took him away from his parents culturally, just as their move hundreds of miles to the north from Mexico had taken them away from their parents geographically. The cultural distance between Richard and his parents also made for emotional distance. And one of the most poignant parts of that for me was that as he surpassed his parents in English, he became very self-conscious about pronouncing anything in Spanish. And so he couldn't even call them anything anymore. And so in order to say something to his mother or father, he got their attention with his eyes, and then he said what he was going to say. But he lost the ability to call them anything because of feeling split by the two languages. And he writes that when he first went to school, he had to think so hard in English, or think so hard about what the English words meant, that he lost his hearing in another way. He lost the ability to hear emotional tones in what people were saying. And so that was he became sort of deaf to emotional language because he had to concentrate so hard on the actual meaning of each word. Once started in this new language, however, there was no stopping him, even though he was aware of what he was losing. He ended up going to Stanford and then on to Oxford for a graduate degree in English literature. And it was as if he had to prove that he could be better at English than the people who had started out in English. But he got stuck. It only worked for a little while. When he was supposed to be writing his dissertation, all of a sudden, he couldn't do it. He just couldn't do anymore. And he finally decided to go home and touch base with his original linguistic and emotional roots. And he ended up, instead of writing a dissertation on English Renaissance literature, writing Hunger of Memory, this book about that I read. And this book has a general tone of loss and sadness about the loss, a nostalgia about what might have been, and a concern that what he had become might be false in some way. At the same time, there's no question, if it were a matter of choice and he could choose, if he could go back and choose, there's no question that Richard Rodriguez would still take the road away from his parents, just as they had taken a road away from theirs. And that may be because he found a way to bridge the huge gap between what he had lost and what he had gained. This is a quote from him. "If because of my schooling I had grown culturally separated from my parents, my education finally had given me ways of speaking and caring about that fact." In one sense, there's no going back and retrieving what was lost, but in another sense there is. And I'm thinking about this a lot in terms of the adoptee experience. A way at least to claim the loss, to mourn it, and to honor what was lost in a way that this same loss made possible. The next book is called Lost in Translation by Eva Hoffman, also focusing a lot on language. The subtitle of this book is A Life in a New Language. At 13, Eva Hoffman left Krakow, Poland, speaking only Polish. And like Richard Rodriguez, she's now a superstar in English. She's an editor of the New York Times Book Review. Now, here's a quote I just love about having a split identity. "Should I marry him?" I asked myself in English. Yes. "Should I marry him?" I asked myself in Polish. No. Lost in Translation is about Hoffman's feeling ripped away from her original language and culture, and feeling that she would never again be completely at home in any language or culture. She writes about what she calls triangulation, letting each language and culture come between her and the other one, so that she feels an outsider to and unsupported by both. But this is a quote from her, "But in my translation therapy, I keep going back over the rifts, not to heal them, but to see that I have been on both sides. Patiently, I use English as a conduit to go back and down, all the way to childhood, almost to the beginning. When I learn to say those first things in the language that has served for detachment and irony and abstraction, I begin to see where the languages I've spoken have their correspondences, how I can move between them without being split by the differences." Eventually, Hoffman moves beyond her sense of loss to an appreciation of the special perspective that someone from two different worlds can have. This is another quote from her. "The gap cannot be fully closed, but it has also become a chink, a window through which I can observe the diversity of the world. And I'll probably always find myself in the chinks between cultures and subcultures. It's not the worst place to live. It gives you an Archimedean leverage from which to see the world." Next comes Paul Cowan's book, Orphan in History. He's kind of like Eva Hoffman's grandson in that she left Eastern Europe and ended up in New York City by way of Western Canada, and his grandparents left Eastern Europe and he ended up in New York City by way of Chicago, where his parents both grew up. What this grandson of immigrants discovered was that he knew he was Jewish because of anti-Semitism he faced at prep school and because of his parents' reactions to the Holocaust. But he didn't know he had Jewish roots because of any cultural or religious heritage that his family had held on to. They hadn't held on to any of that. In fact, in their very successful drive to be assimilated, to belong in their adopted country, they had let go of things that would have made them stand out as different. For instance, their name had been Cohen. They changed it to Cowan. They had ham for Easter dinner. They did not celebrate the Jewish holidays. I think Paul Cowan did a great job in this book of respecting his parents' and grandparents' great desire to belong, to be real Americans, but at the same time respecting his own feeling that something was missing, that he needed more of his own ancestral heritage, both for himself and to pass on to his children. For me, this mirrors the adoptees wanting real belonging in their adoptive families, but not at the price of being cut off from their origins. Paul Cowan, in fact, learned that through a long search, he learned that he was the descendant of rabbis and ended up an observant Jew himself. And his book, Orphan in History, ends with his daughter's bat mitzvah. He also ends up redefining for himself and for the rest of us what it means to be a real American. This is a quote from him. The joy, or the emotion, the joy one feels when one retrieves a shard of one's buried past was, I realized, more American than any public sight one witnesses on Thanksgiving Day or the 4th of July. We have all amputated our histories, surrendered the memories that are entwined with tradition, things you love because you know them well. And this is a continuation of that quote. Once I realized that, I began to see that my clumsy, halting, sometimes ludicrous search for my very specific roots was one way of solving an endemic American problem, the unwitting suppression of scores of cultures that has impoverished us all. I'm not so sure it was unwitting, and it certainly wasn't in the case of adoptees who have had their original heritage suppressed. But we know that this has led to the emotional impoverishment of adoptees, and I would say the emotional impoverishment of whole adoptive families as well. Okay, the last three books represent different kinds of bicultural experience than the immigrants or descendants of immigrants. Every Goodbye Ain't Gone is by Idabari Njeri, an African-American woman who, at least when she wrote this book, was living in Los Angeles and writing for the LA Times. Most African Americans are descendants of people who were involuntary immigrants, if you can call them immigrants at all. They did manage to bring with them and hand down some things from their original cultures, even though they were violently yanked out of those cultures and systematically stripped of much of their cultural heritage. But another cultural legacy that African Americans have is from the institution of slavery and their people's survival of that institution and its aftermath. There are two things that Idabari Njeri writes about that I think are particularly relevant to the adoptee experience. One is the experience of invisibility, of being overlooked or even looked through as if you're not there. And a number of African Americans have written about that. Here is something that she wrote about her father. His unreconciled identities, the classic schizophrenia of being black and an American, the contradictions of internalizing whole the cultural values of a society that sees you, when it sees you at all, as life in one of its lower forms, stoked his alcoholism. For adoptees, it's just a part of us that gets overlooked or treated as invisible. Our pre-adoptive identity, history, heritage, which we can be even forbidden by law to see ourselves. And in my case, my parents pretty much never seemed to notice my appearance. They never commented on my looking like anything at all, which certainly made me feel invisible. And I think it was because to acknowledge that I had an appearance at all was to acknowledge the other set of parents more than they felt that they could. or wanted to. Then there's the business of names. Ida Bari and Jerry grew up as Jill Moreland, and as an adult she chose to give herself an African name. This is a quote from her. "Had we not been enslaved, we would not have been cut off from our culture, lost our indigenous languages, and been compelled to use European names. The loss of our African culture is a tragic fact of history, and the conflict it poses is a profound one that has divided blacks many times since emancipation. Do we accept the loss and assimilate totally, or do we try to reclaim our culture and synthesize it with our present reality?" Any adoptees can identify with this thing about names? Names stand for identity. Do we identify with our names? Do we feel that they tell people who we are? Some people feel robbed of their true names. Some people give themselves totally new names, which they feel represent themselves better. And some of us play around with our names and get them to symbolize our hybrid identities. You know, I use my birth name as my middle name. I have a friend who uses the first name that her birth mother gave her as her middle name. Florence Fisher combines her adoptive first name with her birth last name. I have an African American friend who got an African first name in Africa when she was working there, but she kept her American last name. And so there are different ways to play around in that way. Now here's another kind of bicultural experience. To live along a border between two cultures. Gloria Anzaldúa grew up in Texas, which we have to remember has belonged to Indians, Comanches, Apaches, to Spain, to Mexico, to itself in a way as the independent Republic of Texas, and to the United States. That doesn't mean that Gloria Anzaldúa's ancestors necessarily moved around a lot, but they were fought over a lot. Her book is, one of her books is called Borderlands La Frontera, and it's both poetry and prose, and it's bilingual. It goes back and forth between Spanish and English, like she does, and like her experience goes back and forth between two cultures. First, I'm going to read a poem from Borderlands, and then I'm going to read a paragraph, a quote that I got so excited about that a couple of Christmases ago I photocopied it onto bright green paper and I sent it out to some of my adoptee friends as a sort of a Christmas card. The poem is called Borderlands. To live in the borderlands means you are neither Hispana, India, Negra, Española, ni Gabacha. Eres mestiza, mulata, half-breed, caught in the crossfire between camps while carrying all 5 races on your back, not knowing which side to turn to run from. To live in the borderlands means knowing that the India in you, betrayed for 500 years, is no longer speaking to you. That Mexicanas call you rajetas, that denying the Anglo inside you is as bad as having denied the Indian or black. Cuando vives en la frontera, people walk through you, the wind steals your voice. You're a burra, bue, scapegoat, forerunner of a new race, half and half, both woman and man, neither a new gender. To live in the borderlands means to put chili in the borscht, eat whole wheat tortillas, speak Tex-Mex with a Brooklyn accent, be stopped by La Migra at the border checkpoints. Living in the borderlands means you fight hard to resist the golden elixir beckoning from the bottle, the pull of the gun barrel, the rope crushing the hollow of your throat. In the borderlands, you are the battleground where enemies are kin to each other. You are at home, a stranger. The border disputes have been settled. The volley of shots have shattered the truce. You are wounded, lost in action, dead, fighting back. To live in the borderlands means the mill with the razor-white teeth wants to shred off your olive-red skin, crush out the kernel, your heart, pound you, pinch you, roll you out, smelling like white bread but dead. To survive the borderlands, you must live sin fronteras, be a crossroads. And this is a quote that's prose. Living on borders and in margins, keeping intact one's shifting and multiple identity and integrity is like trying to swim in a new element, an alien element. There is an exhilaration in being a participant in the further evolution of humankind, in being worked on. I have the sense that certain faculties, not just in me, but in every border resident, colored or non-colored, and dormant areas of consciousness are being activated, awakened. The full title of this last book is My Place, an Aborigine's Stubborn Quest for Her Truth, Heritage, and Origins. How can an adoptee resist that when you see that in a bookstore? This book by Sally Morgan is an Australian story about a biological family's hiding from its own members their Aboriginal heritage. It's also about the effect on 3 different generations in this family of one person in the family insisting on the truth. Here's a quote. How deprived we would have been if we had been willing to let things stay as they were. We would have survived, but not as a whole people. We would never have known our place, which is, our place is a concept in Aboriginal culture that's very important. It's a real physical place that is sacred. Mom, in particular, had been very deeply affected by the whole trip. And her mother says, "To think I nearly missed all this. All my life, I've only been half a person. I don't think I realized how much of me was missing until I came north. Thank God you're stubborn, Sally." That was Sally's mother talking, and in her grandmother even more. You watch someone's self-loathing from a stigmatized identity slowly turn into pride. The stigma, and stigma means mark of disgrace, had originally come from the way white colonizers of Australia had seen and treated Aborigines. But the people stigmatized by this couldn't do anything to turn this around as long as the stigma was so powerful that they couldn't bear to talk about it. The stigma kept them from talking about it, and not talking about it kept them from learning anything about their original culture. It was unspeakable for them until one person broke through the silence and the secrets and the lies. That opened the door to actually learning something about their original culture, and this allowed them to value it. If you don't know anything about it, you don't know what's good about it. And then they could take the shame and disgrace of being Aborigines and do the opposite of internalizing it. They could rid themselves of it because they could displace the shame and disgrace with a new pride in their original culture. To me, this is very much like adoptees who first have to break through silence and secrets and lies, sometimes lies, about their pre-adoptive background. And with all that mystery around your pre-adoptive background, you assume at least sometimes that it must be pretty disgraceful. But then if you can break through the silence, the secrets, the lies, that allows you to know something about your pre-adoptive background, then you learn that there are good things about it, which can be a source of pride, as well as simply having a part of yourself that's not missing anymore. Those are the books that I've really been excited about. And Can somebody start off by speaking to yes?
Well, I've read most of the books you have mentioned, which is really good. However, I have a real problem with, I'm Korean, I'm adopted, I'm a lesbian, I'm left-handed, I'm short, so I have a lot of identity and stuff like that. However, I think that, this workshop is really misleading in its title because I don't understand what the word bicultural means in your context. Also, being bicultural, quote unquote bicultural, to me is not the same as being adopted. In the sense that you're talking about using it as a metaphor is okay to a point, but there's a limit. And I think it is, it threatens the valid validity and the importance of people of color who are not adopted and adopted, their experiences as people of color in a predominantly white society. So I have a lot of problems with using racial issues, racism and race, as a metaphor for an adoptee's experience in the society. I'm an immigrant. I was born in Korea, so I have, I have all those experiences that you talk about in your books, in those books that you mentioned. But as an adoptee, I don't say, well, I mean, for me it's exacerbated as being a person of color, but I don't see the connection is it's symbolic, but it's also, I think it's.
You feel it takes away from the meaning on both sides.
Well, it's like saying, well, I've been through a Holocaust, and that to me minimizes the experience of people who are actually been through a Holocaust. It also minimizes the experience by saying, I couldn't hear the language of my people because I had to try to understand the English language, so that I would compensate to the point that I, got my BA in poetry in English. Is saying that minimizes the experience of actually deaf people. I mean, so you have to be really, I think I have to be really careful in saying, this is like this, and therefore this is valid. So I have a lot of problems with that. I'm very disturbed by this.
Okay, I just want to comment that for me, this is where I'm coming from. I feel like I can use these people who are so articulate about their experience as models for me in dealing with my own thing. It doesn't mean I'm saying it's the same, but I can look at how they've integrated their split parts, and I can use them to help me. That's all.
I think it is an individual experience. I'd like to hear more about if you don't relate with what Penny is saying. Can you talk about what the differences are and maybe what you would have liked to?
Well, I mean, like I deal with lesbian, gay communities and predominantly white ones, and they say to me, "Well, I'm oppressed. I'm a minority. However, you can't bring in homophobia. You can't compare homophobia with racism. They're two forms of oppression, and they come from discrimination. But I could be closeted as a lesbian. I cannot be closeted as an Asian woman in this society. So those are the distinctions that really need to be addressed. That is saying, I'm oppressed, or my heritage has been ripped away from me. My heritage has been ripped away from me, but not necessarily, well, partly because I was adopted, but also because I was raised white. I was raised in a white family. So it's connected, but it's also very distinct. Right. And I think the connections really need to can be very helpful and reaffirming, but the distinctions really need to be addressed.
Mm-hmm.
I think in a lot of cases, and being biracial myself, the distinctions are addressed. I just, at some point in my life, as I started to mature, I realized the distinctions and focused on the dichotomy and tried to find the roots, the beginning places of each of the pluralism, as you say, my identities. Where did this one begin? Where did this one begin? So I'm really not confused as to the issues. I clearly see where they are. I see the racism. I see the effects of being multiracial in our white society that we live in, that I live in, that we all live in. I think one thing that probably complicates your situation is the added factor, thank you, of your lesbianism.
It's an even more plural identity.
Exactly. It's not even plural anymore. Just to give you an example, my brother is a homosexual who is biracial, and so he's added on another dimension into the whole idea. So for him, I think, to be whole and to understand himself and his role in our society, he must separate the white culture, the African American culture, and now the homosexual or gay issues.
That's why I found the metaphor, the relationship between the bicultural aspect to be fascinating. I think that's very interesting. I think it depends on the individual, because I find double dualities in my life, and so your comparisons I found very interesting.
Are you an adoptee?
Oh yeah, bicultural, interracial.
I didn't mean to, I forgot that we need to use this, I don't.
I think my voice carries.
All right, good.
I am a writer too, working on a book about adoption, and it's a little gal named Rachel in this book who decided at the age of 6 to change her name to her birth name. And the work that she had to go through as a 6-year-old to become another name, and to tell everybody why, and to get everybody in her world to make that shift was an incredibly validating experience for her. And it was confirmed by her teachers in school, who a number of them independently said to me, said to her her adoptive parents, who then passed it on to me, that when she had the former name, they didn't know who she was, and they had to keep looking through her disruptive behavior to see who the child was behind it. But that when she assumed her birth name, that they knew exactly who she was. And I think that's a really important statement. And this little girl seemed to gain measurably in confidence in claiming her birth name.
Who of us wouldn't like to have been that strong at 6 years old? Yeah.
Well, I find your metaphor very useful.
Well, just hold on to this. So
The birth father I never knew was Mexican, and not looking Mexican myself, it has added to sort of a complication of that issue. And the daughter I relinquished is Cherokee, Mexican, Welsh, Dutch, Hawaiian, Filipino, Portuguese. So it's like the two people at both ends of my life, my father and my daughter, being very ethnically mixed. And then myself, more of a hidden dimension. It's so complex. And I grew up on the border and live in Hawaii, which is very multicultural. So this was very helpful to me.
Wait, can you say anything specific? What?
It's just trying to integrate all those dimensions. And as I spoke last night in the group, even for me, just integrated being both a birth parent and step-parent adoptee is complicated enough. And then when I add all of the multicultural aspects, it's so complex. The poem that you read just really struck my heart. That's just what it's like.
This is Anna side A. Please turn your tape over and continue on side B.
Really, I want to acknowledge that I just felt myself really responding to that last line you read about that I don't think I realized how much of me was missing until I came north. And God, your stubbornness out. And that's a part of, I think, a message that I've come to give to myself, to be thankful for my own stubbornness and my own persistence and my own, wherever that came from, to know myself and to, even though there wasn't much support in my family for doing that, and also realizing how much of myself was missing until I came north, and to not know that until you do it. It has been such an incredible experience for me.
A surprise.
Yes, yes. I describe it often as I feel differently than I ever have in my whole life. I feel grounded, I feel whole. I suddenly have a clear sense of direction, purpose, and meaning in my life that was missing. This is very transformative.
You know, I think as a social worker, I'm impressed by even all the old records. They will refer to the background, that whether, you know, Czechoslovakian or Italian. This became the only thing that was ever recorded. You know, except that you probably had two sexes that got together and made you. That actually, it's because I think we are an immigrant population. People who, in England, for instance, they are always English, no matter where they came from. But we are an immigrant population, and this
Except for Native Americans.
Native Americans, except Native Americans. And important, it's evidently important to us, because I remember when a daughter who was adopted came with her adopted father to find out about her. It was before I knew they weren't supposed to find out. I told them, and she was so thrilled because people had taken her for an Italian, I don't know, and somehow when she found she was German, she felt better. I would have felt worse, but then. But I mean, it was one of those things that was significant to her. And but I think it's interesting that was the recorded thing, and the only recorded thing many times.
Maybe some people thought of that as a safe thing you could record.
Well, maybe it's safe. Of course, I believe in hybrids. My grandchildren that are in hybrid situations are much smarter than the ones that are WASP all the way.
I was really impressed with how deprived would we have been if we had allowed things to be as they were. And just the absolute need that decisions and policies and ways people were taught were the right ways 20 and 30 years ago. As people question and as people realize the hurts and the wrongs that are done, we're not content to leave things as they were. And we're only content to go forward and to continue to improve and to meet needs of people and to allow people to be proud of their ethnic heritage and to be proud of the families that they're with. And just to find that space of where they're at, just not to be content where you were in ignorance is such an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah.
I think it's important that this whole thing revolves around, central issues in a person's identity. Ethnic background, cultural background is basically how American society looks at you. It's how you look. And if you don't have the skills or the wherewithal to how to deal with it and survive in this society, I think that's the responsibility of adoptive parents. And I think it's really important. I think there's a lot of lip service about the importance of culture and ethnic background, but ultimately people say, well, you're going to be American. But that doesn't help someone coming from a different society and having to deal with the inherent racism and discrimination. I think, we leave our children alone if we do that. And if we're going to adopt transracially, then we really have to take on that race in the family. And I think there's not enough attention. That's one of the reasons I came to this. Because there's not enough education going on for adoptive families about that. And they're sending kids out into the world really disarmed.
Well, I'd like to get on the coattails of that one. As a clinician, not a member of the triad, I deal with a lot of cross-cultural adoptees, primarily in adolescence. And you know, the hallmarks of many of them and their families is pretty significant denial. I'm from Minnesota, and it's a heavily Scandinavian-based society.
Heavily blonde society.
Heavily blonde society. And you know, we're dealing with kids with names like Carl Larson from, you know, Colombia, and you know, Susie Miller from Korea, and those kind of things, the things that really bounced off some of the quotes. The other thing is some of the kids get stuck in their anger and their denial in terms of, you know, I've had one Korean kid talk about, I don't want to be Korean. Her goal is to dye her hair and get surgery so she can look Caucasian. And I struggle with how to deal with those issues and how to address the denial, and I'm saying that by way of question, and would like some help from people on that, because it's a pretty major issue. The other thing that kind of bounces off it, it's not so much a cultural issue as it is, it's connected with it, because many of the children I have who come from other countries, the birth dates aren't known, and so they come over and they get ascribed birth dates, and then often the adoptive family will use that date and back it up a year, so a kid will have another year to get ready for school. And it kind of catches off into the cultural stuff too, because it's just another loss from
another piece of you missing.
Yeah. So it's kind of a statement question. I don't know where I'm going with it, except that it's a struggle that I deal with as a clinician.
I just wanted to make one more point that I think even in some of the books they point out that even in your own birth families you can have a disassociation of your culture. For example, my parents wanted me to assimilate into this culture and make me American. So I don't have a lot of the heritage. I've had to dig it up through friends and other people to really develop an ethnic identity. I think that's where the responsibility of parents really drives home.
Like people who won't talk to their kids except in English.
Things like
Yeah.
I would like to add on to that. This is an immigrant country, but I'll share an observation of my father. My father came from Italy, and my mother did not. She was Italian, but for a number of generations. When my father came here, he said that one of the first things he realized was that people were insulting him, and he had no idea of it. Because what he found out in this country is that this country has a bad name for everybody. He said, when you come from a country that's a majority, minorities are not looked on with the same suspicion and pejoratives, because they're not a threat. This country, everybody's a threat. And he very much lived his own mixed messages. He wanted to assimilate. On the other hand, he did not want to become part of this conglomerate, because he felt he wasn't wanted by this conglomerate. He would say to you that this country's metaphor of melting pot is bullshit. He would say to you that what we are little conglomerations of cultures that circle the wagons and try to keep everybody else out, at the same time as telling ourselves we're part of a wonderful melting pot country. We give ourselves mixed messages all the time. And I like your metaphor, barring a very well said point that racially you get to a point where you can't pass, you can't hide, you must confront, you must face or be destroyed by the mixed messages. What is more difficult in some ways is when you can pass, when you can bury your past, when you can, as my father did, have to make a decision. Should I learn the language? Should I get rid of this accent? And I will force my kids never to have one, and bury Rome, or will they have a dual ethnicity, and am I in a position to give it to them? The only other point I want to make is I've worked a great deal with immigrant families. And one of the things that we know happens is that children unfairly to them become the arbiters of culture. When parents don't speak this language, the children become the arbiters between the greater culture and the subculture. And what happens to the children is, well, what happens to the family is the traditions begin to break down. When parents have to rely on a 5-year-old to tell them what is this person saying, the authority of the parents in many traditions is undermined. They begin to relinquish that authority. They begin to rely on the children. The children are cast in a role that perhaps they do not want, where this major culture is very attractive to them, but they have no place. And I do find a metaphor for adoptees who don't feel that they have any place. They don't fit anywhere. Because I think many children of immigrant families don't fit anywhere.
Except with other people who have the same experience.
Combine them
if they can
share that. Yeah.
Right.
As an addendum to what you were saying, I am native-born Greek and lived there until I was school age, but adopted by a couple that was native Milwaukeeans. I still live outside Milwaukee. So I was brought into a very Germanic home and raised a good little German. Then as an adult, I tried to make contact with the Greek community such as it is in Milwaukee, and I found out that I was now considered tainted by the Greeks, because the Greeks hate Germans from the atrocities in World War II. And suddenly, I look Greek, but to them I was German and therefore unwelcome, unless perhaps I would renounce my Catholicism and become a good Greek Orthodox and perhaps an Orthodox nun, and then I might be acceptable. So I couldn't really win because my adoptive relatives never considered me a good German. I was too dark-haired and dark-eyed. And when I tried to find solace with my own people, I thought among the Greeks, suddenly I was not a Greek enough and too Germanic. So I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to win.
Mm-hmm. To go back to your question and your answer, I think the two maybe go together a little bit. The question that you had about what do you do with the Japanese that wants to dye her hair and have surgery and become Scandinavian or Korean, sorry. I wonder if that's an opportunity, if there's an opportunity there for you to bring in the teenagers' parents and consider it as a family issue.
The interesting point about this particular girl is her family are instrumental in starting and having maintained a camp for Korean youth that meets every summer, year after year, and has been for the last 5 or 6 years in the Twin City area.
But that still doesn't address.
I still have done that, but I mean, it's part of a family issue.
Does your client know that you may experience as an older, a wiser adult in some ways, experience some sense of loss at watching her kill off this first part of her?
Yeah.
How does she respond to that?
She looks at me like I'm from a different planet, like, why is that a problem for you? It's certainly not a problem for me. But I've talked a lot about how she looks disconnected, and it feels sad that she's killing her country, and and essentially herself, she talks about how she looks ugly. She's gorgeous, she's beautiful, but she's not gorgeous in the way she wants to be. It's more of the pain and denial.
I think it's hard really talking to I think as a Korean person, I'm identifying with your client because you're a white man, and I think it's really hard talking to a person, a white person, saying I'm ugly and having the white person try to validate my looks. So I think it would be much more helpful if you got a person of color or an Asian woman specifically to talk to your client. To be able to identify more and be able to project her feelings onto this client of yours, because it's I had people telling me that I was very cute and on and on and on, and it did nothing for me. It did very little. because I had a great deal of internalized racism, which is what your client has, particularly since she's been raised in Minnesota, or Milwaukee, Minnesota?
Yes.
It's all the same to me. Forgive me.
If you've seen one Midwestern state, you've seen them all.
I'm from the East Coast, so it's. I mean, it's, and that's what I want to get into. Is I'm going to social work school, and I want to get a master's in social work and practice therapy and post-adoption services, so that I can provide services to children who experienced similar things that I did, and I didn't have any of those services given to me. I was the 1,000th child to be adopted from Korea. There are now over 300,000 children adopted from Korea into this country. And I also want to make a point that talking about minority issues, I think we have a real problem with the language, particularly the English language, in regards to cultural issues. First of all, I have a lot of problems with multicultural. What does that mean? Bicultural, cross-cultural, transracial, transcultural, all those terminologies I have a real problem with, as well as the melting pot, which you spoke of, and the mosaic now is the big word. And also, I have a problem with minority, the word minority. We are not minorities. I am not a minority in the global sense. I dominate this world and the planet as far as population is concerned. And I am a minority, quote unquote, minority in this country, but that's it. And I make a real strong point of making that to everyone here, because I don't think people are aware of that. And I think that really needs to be pointed out and made sure that people are aware of that.
Well, I don't know why I was going to mention the word multicultural, cross-cultural, transcultural. I think that it does pertain to certain people. And to point something you read about people in North America have a discomfort with the plural identity in today's society. I am interracial. I am two things, and possibly three, possibly five. That's what I am, and if people don't like that, that's fine. But to describe myself, I can call myself mulata, black, white, whatever you want to call it.
I think it's fine when you describe yourself, but when other people start describing you, you have to reclaim.
Well, see, that's the thing, though. Other people want me to decide. Other people want me to label myself in North America, in the United States of North America. They want you to put a label on yourself. They cannot see plurality. They cannot say, oh, you're both things, or you're three things, or you're four things, or whatever. So it's very difficult, and I think we have to have the freedom to express ourselves as we like, but not to term somebody, not to label somebody as we see it, or on a form check one or the other.
Of course, I think one of the things is that most of the intercultural ones that I placed in adoption were half white, half black, but everybody gets to be black. Sometimes the birth mother would be white and wanted her child to go into a white home, and yet in our culture, that child was considered black.
That depends, though. I mean, I can say that, okay, I feel black. I feel very black, but if I go into Compton, where I live, a lot of black people do not consider me black, which white people cannot see. They cannot understand that.
What do they consider you?
They consider me white. Okay, I grew up in the suburbs of San Diego, and so the way I talk, I don't talk the same way they talk in Compton. This is one of the most fascinating things I think I found about black people, is that
it's the language.
Because of, it depends. It's a lot of things. I mean, I grew up in a black and white household. I grew up with that. But I also grew up in the suburbs. But those white people did not treat me white. That's what the most important thing to me.
Yeah.
That the black people think, because of where I grew up, I'm acting white or talking white.
And that's uncomfortable.
Not even necessarily because I grew up in a white family, and I'm an adoptee. And everybody was white. And now coming out here, and I meet black people, and they're like, you talk funny. They don't accept me at all. And they say, why do you talk so white? And it's like, well, what do you mean by how come I talk so white? And I feel really uncomfortable around them, and I don't fit in either way.
They want you to choose too, and you can't be pro.
And for me as an adoptee, when people say, but who are your real parents? And some people wanted to be the adoptive parents, and some people wanted to be the birth parents.
You can't have mixed.
And they can't see that I have two sets of real parents, two real sets of parents.
And it's true. In coming from white and black, in both cultures, they want you to choose. However, you cannot choose to be white because of the color of your skin.
And if you choose black, that's your business. But you might feel like you're just denying yourself something.
But this is so true. I mean, I feel like I'm denying a whole host of wonderful people. And I think my healthy recovery from of being a victim of multi-ethnicity was when I actively researched my genetic heritage. One strain I found and the other strain I found, and I'll tell you something that was really a shock to me, which was very, very interesting, and I brought this out in the family. On my mother's side of the family, where they are white, and I have a great-grandmother to the 7th generation who was a slave. And she married a white man, and everyone else married a white person. And so the African was erased out of the...
Hidden.
Well, hidden out of the gene pool. And when, I discovered this and I started bringing this around, I said, see? And some people, I have the picture. I have a picture of her, by the way. It's fading now, but no one really wants to accept that. And then I discovered on my father's side, I didn't discover any white, but I discovered a dichotomy. On my mother's side, everyone was pretty much farmers and blue collar workers and what have you. And then on my father's side, as I went way back, my great-great-grandfather graduated from university, and he was the direct son of a slave. And so I thought it was an interesting dichotomy there. I mean, being ethnic, and I'm an ethnic individual, a white ethnic, because even Americans who are either Scandinavian or English are ethnic to some degree, as is Africans ethnic. I kind of feel that I'm now becoming more integrated with people like Kendra and Marnie and myself, who are ethnic or multi-ethnic. And there's a new wave of people. I mean, when I go to New York and I see all these different people, colors, I never felt so home before. Here in California, which I've spent my entire life, I've always felt different. And I've never lived in a black community, but because of my color, I've had to associate with blacks, because to some degree, they're the only ones that really accept me as an individual. It's been difficult.
It seems to me that one thing that's open to people who have this hybrid identity of one kind or another is to do something to express that, to act out your hybridness in a positive way. Artists who somehow put it together in their art, or write a book about it, or find other people that are like you. And I was thinking, I wondered, in terms of your appearance and learning to see yourself as beautiful, if you haven't been able to do that by finding other people that look like you and you find them beautiful. And
well, 2 years ago I went to an Asian Pacific Island lesbian retreat and in Santa Cruz, and I did a workshop on Asian lesbians who were adopted, and there were 6 of us, so it was wonderful. But I'm also co-editing an anthology on Asian Pacific lesbians in the North America, which include Canada and the U.S. And I've published poetry, and I'm international speaker on international adoptions, and I'm doing a workshop tomorrow. So I'm active. You know, it's not like I'm stuck in my anger, and which was a previous workshop to this. You know, I'm really connected with my Asian identity in the best way that I can be. But you know, I realized being in the U.S. and having been adopted into a white family and been raised white, that all of my Asian identity is filtered. It's what I call whiteified. And I think that there's, you know, that's okay, you know, because I had to go back to Korea and decide where I want to fit in, and I have gone back to Korea. But it's, you know, those are the things that I have to deal with.
You're lucky. You can go back to Korea.
Where do you go?
Yeah, where do I go?
But I don't know, I mean, are you lucky? Because when you go
I don't know
back,
if
do you
I'm
feel like
lucky.
you
I mean,
fit
because
there?
no, I'm a foreigner there, so it's not. I mean, I have a major language barrier. I have not been accepted into the Korean community here, nor do I really want to be, because they're racist and they're sexist in a big major way, and homophobic. So it's like, oh great, my people are really, you know, it's a great culture. However, you know, lots of problems. So it's, you know, I can't say that I'm, you know, it's all a struggle. Even being here at this conference, I haven't seen any other Korean Asian lesbians who are adopted to white families.
Forget the left-handedness.
I mean, we're left-handed and short, raised in Rhode Island, okay? So, you know, so I'm isolated. So we talk about isolation, marginalization. It's profound for me, you know. And people talk about. I'm hearing stories and testimonies about testimonials and how people have found each other, blah blah blah, negative and positive, painful and joyful. I don't get that experience. I lose out on that one. So it's just like, whose losses are more profound than others? Me. You know, it's not that way. For me, I know what I have, what I don't have, and I'm dealing with it in the best way I possibly can, and I'll always be dealing with it. And that's why I want to go into post-adoption services and really make some waves and help these kids not have to experience what I went through with such pain, agony, for when I was growing up, and provide for them the role model that I did not have.
That's also a way to enact what you are in a positive way, is to help other people with it.
It's a therapeutic process.
Yeah.
Social work.
Well, I just want to say that I'm coming at it from the perspective of just having adopted a little boy from Peru, you know, a year ago. So I'm laughing when you use the word whiteified culture, whiteified Oriental culture, because I'm kind of giving him whiteified.
Asian. Oriental's a bad word. I'll talk about that tomorrow.
And let me just inject that I just learned that mulata comes from mule.
It does.
Yeah.
That's because it's a cross between a donkey and a horse.
Right.
That's the only
So
thing,
it's nothing that anybody wants to use if they can.
Well, the thing is, in using labels, you know, from what I understand with labels, words fall out of favor and the new words come in, and so, I mean, no label is ever really going to work, so you just have to do the best you can.
Except that some are, you can learn that some are better than others.
Right.
No, actually, you should hear this, because I think it's important to set that's an excuse, and I think that you really need to hear what somebody like me, and I forget your name, Kendra, are saying in terms of labeling themselves. If we are going to rename ourselves, you have to hear it and say, well, I didn't know that, well, this is this year's term.
Right, can't keep up with the new.
Oh, I know.
That's the new one.
Negro, African American,
You know,
Black
maybe
American.
yeah, there's so many terms. However, you really have to hear it, especially as an adopted parent of a child of color, particularly from South America. I mean, I think it's really important to be able to.
I just want to know what I can
hear
call
this and say, oh, okay, this is what the term is, and be aware of it. And if you're not,
Okay, but I think that you were starting to say something and you didn't get a chance to.
Yeah.
That was a
Sorry.
preamble, right?
Yeah, that was a preamble. What I am really, what I would like to do is to help him, in other words, to try to do some preventative type things with him so that he doesn't get to be 10 or 16 or whatever, and you know, I don't want him to go through all this stuff. You know, I want to try to help him, you know, along the way. So that's part of my. I like what you said about to be a crossroads, because, for example, I gave him a Spanish name, Miguel, because I wanted him to have,
you know, that label, if you will, that identified him with his past, you know, and I got some resistance, you know, from my husband because he said, oh, you know, he's gonna be an American, you know, and kids are gonna tease him when he gets in school. I said, that's all right. I said, he'll have that name, and if he wants to change it to Michael when he gets to school, or if he wants to call himself Mickey because Mickey is used for Miguel in Peru, he can do it. I mean, he'll have the options.
Yeah, it's a good name for going either way.
Yeah, and I really thought about it. You know, my husband thought I was ridiculous to go to these great lengths in choosing this name, you know, but it's really important to me to get this right, you know. So I'm trying to do those little things. I'm learning Spanish, and
that's great.
You know, we can have little conversations now, you know, so I talk to him in Spanish and English, that kind of thing. And my real hope is that we'll be able to go back and see his birth mother from time to time. We did meet her, we had pictures of her, we have a video of her, you know. But I think the thing that I realize in listening to all of this is that really no matter what I do, you know, it's not gonna do it all. In other words, he's very Latin looking, you know, he's dark eyes, he's got cute little fudgy cheeks, you know, he's, you know, kind of olive skin. I mean, he's always gonna, he is gonna be vulnerable to prejudice that I can't protect him from. And that's just a reality that, you know, we are just gonna have to live with.
He's going to have a plural identity, and it's not easy to have a plural identity, and that'll be part of who he is.
But the main thing is that you acknowledge it.
Right.
Absolutely.
Right, and say, oh no, you shouldn't have any problems here.
And that's why.
I just heard a good article. I can't remember it, and if I can, I'll give it to you. But I mean, you're doing exactly what the article talks about in terms of the best thing you can do is recognize that when you adopt a child from another culture, you are now a multicultural family. And in that acknowledgement, you give him permission to be vulnerable, and you allow him access to you when he suffers his vulnerability. I just want to applaud you for that.
Kendra.
I was just going to say that teenagers, I'm not a specialist or anything professional, we all go through identity crisis. And all of us, as you can see, because we're adopted and we're adoptees, again, we go through a double identity crisis. And there's a lot of controversy as far as transracial adoptions, black and white, whatever it can be, international adoptions. And I just think that with support, making it a multicultural home, and having role models, I think is so important. Role models of, that's what I was going to mention, I don't know if the girl has, you know, Korean role models besides her.
Not yet.
Yeah, it's
I'd
just
like
so
to develop
important
that,
to grow up with different things in your household, different people that you go out to see, different people outside of the community if it's one color. That, you know, you have to make an effort. And even if it's controversial and you don't believe it should happen, or if you do, you just have to take the individual setting and make the most of it.
Can you make it short? I just have a couple of...
I just have a question, whoever can answer it. I'm wondering what the effect is, how helpful or not. In a transracial adoption where there are white parents, if people have siblings of color, so that you're
I would think that would be good.
I don't know. If that feels more than like a connection, no?
I don't have that.
I think that's very important.
Yeah.
My two children are adopted, and they're both Hispanic, and that's been vital.
To feel less alone, to feel a family connection.
And they are different from their parents, you know, they're different from us, but they're together in their difference. I think it's vital. Also, though, if you adopt two children from the same country, whatever, doesn't necessarily mean the children are going to get along.
Right.
Because they're both from the same country. So there might be, you know, there's other complications with that.
If you have two biological children, they may not get along.
They're going to get along.
Right.
But then there's a lot of these subliminal things that go on too. Like when you have a person of color, how much of one color do they look? sometimes one of a fair skin is favored over one of a darker skin.
Let me just, can I interrupt you? I just have my brilliant conclusions. Well, I just wanted to say that, to sort of sum up this, memoirs by bicultural people can help us see our own experience as adoptees in a context of other people struggling with identities that are complicated, contradictory, partially lost, mysterious, stigmatized, and/or plural. With such identities, we find ourselves split, cut off from parts of ourselves, standing out as different and thus less valued or not acknowledged at all, not seen, or perhaps overcompensating for our differences by trying to blend in or to be more Catholic than the Pope, that sort of thing. Feeling only qualified belonging if we feel belonging at all, and having our loyalties challenged, like, how can you be loyal to that other side, or how can you be loyal to us, etc. Facing lies, secrets, and silence about our identities, feeling we don't have a real identity. So this kind of identity isn't easy. It's a challenge, a puzzle that we struggle with in various ways, that usually involves a search of some sort, a quest to reclaim a part of our identities that we want to try to repossess. Then comes bridging the gap, integrating, synthesizing, bridging, bringing the parts together into some kind of whole of your own choosing. And finally, acceptance of our hybrid identity, which is who we really are. And that kind of identity can have some specific strengths about it, which is having a wider perspective than people who are stuck with just one culture or one identity. Being creative, becoming a creative person because we've had to reach for our identities and to invent some way of putting it all together. And then finally being able to be bridges, to be borderless, as Gloria Anzaldúa suggests, a crossroads for others who feel split or stigmatized or trapped in a narrow identity. Become a social worker. Because we can appreciate everyone's universal belonging, that we're more open to that than anyone else because we do bridge gaps, and that's what I've gotten out of this.
It's wonderful.
Thank you. This is the end of this session. Thank you.